I'm Bob Barnett, and this is my Elmwood. Here we are at one of my favorite spots at Elmwood. This is Leno's Circle, and it's the very center of the cemetery. If you look at a map, you'll see that the design of the cemetery literally radiates out away from this spot. And I love it for many reasons. I love it for the big magnolia trees and the big white oak, which is one of my favorite trees in the cemetery. I love it for the big monuments that are old from the 1870s and 80s. And I love it for other monuments like the Max Rose Memorial, which is one of the newest monumental additions at Elmwood, and the monument for my dear friend Diane Price, and another Memphis musician, Sid Selvage. I love Oak Alley, which is ironically named because it's lined not with oak trees, but with crepe myrtles. But it's one of the finest uses of crepe myrtles that I've ever seen. In the summer, these trees are laden down with pink blooms, and sometimes just before a summer thunderstorm, you'll see this road covered in pink blossoms, and it's so beautiful. My own plots are here in this area of Elmwood. It's where I decided I would like to rest forever. But my favorite story is that of Emily Sutton, and it's my favorite story in the entire cemetery. So this is the grave of Emily Sutton, and Emily was a Memphis madam. We don't know a whole lot about her life that led up to her becoming a madam. We do know that she had a home, what they called back then a sporting house, or a brothel at the corner of Washington and 2nd Streets. And when the yellow fever epidemic came in 1873, Emily did not flee the city like more than half the population did, but she stayed behind. She turned her house into a hospital and began to nurse the sick there. And then she got sick and died with the disease. We don't know, as I said, much about her, but what we do know, we know mainly from her will, and we keep a copy of her will in our office. And it starts off and it says, "I, Emily Sutton, being of sound mind, but dying." So she had already contracted the fever and she wanted to get her affairs in order. She had very specific instructions about her burial. She wanted to be buried at Elmwood. She wanted a metallic coffin. She did not want a large or ostentatious grave or any kind of unnecessary display. Now, ostentatious is a judgment call, but you can tell she got a very fine monument, one of the finest in the cemetery. And even people who don't know her story often stop to take a picture here because it's so beautiful. And it's one of the most fascinating stories in the cemetery because Emily was originally buried as she requested. She was buried in another part of the cemetery with a small grave, no big fine stone like this. But several years after she died, someone moved her to this location. And this location is important because if you look across the street, this is Leno's Circle. And Leno's Circle in the 1870s was the place to be buried in Memphis. This is where society's movers and shakers were being buried. So whoever moved her here did not put her in Leno's Circle, but he put her right on the edge. The stone has a lot of, I think, well, maybe not so hidden messages, but it has a lot of messages. It's a very humanizing stone. On the side, there is a poem, and the poem says, "Let sweet-voiced mercy plead for her who calmly sleeps beneath this sod, nor erring man in pride usurp the province of her judge, her God." In other words, don't judge her. You have no right to judge her. Only God can judge her. Her name is in big letters on the front of her stone. It says Sutton. And then above that it says Emily Sutton. That was her given name, what they would have called back then her Christian name. She was not known as Emily Sutton in Memphis. She was known as Fanny Walker. And Fanny Walker was a common name for a prostitute. And that's how she was known in the city back then. Everything about this stone is meant to communicate a message. And I think it does. Its location, right across the street from Leno's Circle, her name, the poem, it all says she's a human person, a real person. And I think it was meant to send a message to the people across the street. And apparently it did that, because when this stone was erected, it caused a stir, it caused a storm. And as a result, there were 3 plaques installed around the stone. And those plaques on the ground say Fanny Walker, Fanny Walker, Fanny Walker, so that if you were just walking by, you would realize this is not just anyone's grave. This is the grave of the prostitute, Fanny Walker. So one of the lessons from Emily's life, I think, is that often the people that you don't expect are the ones who rise up in hard circumstances and fulfill the needs. I mean, she was taking care of others. One of the last things that she did was she made a donation to the orphans home that had been established to take care of the children that were being orphaned by the yellow fever. Her obituary called her a soiled dove, but they went on to talk about all the good things that Emily had done in her lifetime. And I love this story, and I love this monument, and I love Elmwood.